Snow fell on Christmas Eve not like weather, but like a memory, soft, persistent, and without apology. It smoothed over the jagged wounds of the land, whispered across broken fences and brittle twigs, muffling the wild edges of the world. Out on the edge of Silver Creek, past where the town dared to keep roads, stood a crooked-limbed cabin made of old wood and older silence. Inside, a woman moved like smoke, quiet, practiced, deliberate. Her name was My Lin. She was 34, a fact the town knew but never spoke of. They had once called her a curiosity when she arrived with her husband, then a tragic figure when he died in a mining collapse. Now, they simply called her the Chinese widow. Not much changed in how they looked at her, except that now they expected less. My Lin wore her grief the way others wore aprons, tied about her middle, a constant presence. But hers wasn't the kind that wailed or sought comfort in the town's pity. It was the kind that baked bread in the dark, mended clothes that would never be worn again, and practiced her calligraphy on old newspapers long after the ink had dried. Her days were made of wood smoke and water hauling, of tending to a small flock of chickens and brushing out the horse whose name, Jasper, she kept. She let the fire burn low sometimes, just to see how long she could stand the cold. It was this deep, devouring cold on Christmas Eve that changed things. The wind howled strange, not mournful, but with a sharp, warning cry. My Lin had bundled herself for the woods, axe in hand, to collect the last dry kindling before the sky turned to ice. That's when she saw it. At first, it was just a shape half swallowed by snow. A dark, crooked thing sprawled between brush and fallen logs. She approached slowly, boots crunching, hand steady on the axe handle. A man. His clothes were that of a rancher, but torn and stained. A heavy wool coat was soaked through and frozen to his side. An outsider. That word came into her head not as an accusation, but as a whisper, shaped by the voices of town gossip and fireside fear. He was dying. That much was clear. Snow had started to blanket his legs like a burial rite. His breath was shallow, fluttering in his throat like a moth caught in linen. She stood above him a long while, her own breath blooming into fog. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to leave him. Ride to town and let the sheriff handle it. Let the land finish what it started. But My Lin had never been much for what passed as sensible in Silver Creek. She dropped the axe. It didn't feel like a decision, more like a moment she'd been walking toward for years. Getting him back to the cabin took half her strength and all her will. He was heavy with unconsciousness, a dead weight that sagged and dragged. Her fingers screamed in the cold, knees bruised from kneeling, back wet with sweat that turned to frost. Inside, she laid him by the fire, stripped the wet from his limbs, and cleaned the gash at his side with hands that didn't shake until they were finished. His blood was dark against the pale cloth. She packed the wound with moss and clean rags, whispering prayers in a language the town had never heard. He didn't wake. Not that night, not the next day, but he breathed. My Lin slept in the rocking chair, keeping one eye on the man she did not know, her late husband's rifle close, but her fear further. She left water by his side, changed his bandages, and watched for signs that death had taken notice. Through it all, she said nothing. The quiet of the cabin was no longer empty. It held breath and hope and questions. On the third morning, his eyes opened. They were the color of a stormy sky, watching her without flinching, though she saw confusion in them. She met his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had nothing left to barter but honesty. She did not smile. She did not look away. "You're safe," she said, her voice quiet. "For now." He didn't speak. But his eyes lingered on her hands, bandaged from the cold and work, as if wondering what made her carry him from death's edge when others would have turned away. My Lin did not ask his name. Names had power, and it felt too early for power between them. She thought instead about the day the town might come knocking, about what they would say, and how they would call her soft, foolish, and worse. But none of that was now. Now was tea made from pine needles and thin broth from bones she'd meant to save. Now was the fire and the man who didn't die. She found herself studying him when he slept, not out of fear, that had eased, but out of something quieter, more curious. His face was weathered, but not old. His hands, even in stillness, looked like they belonged to someone who knew the land. He had a scar along his jaw like a wire had once tried to steal his words. He healed slowly, ate little, and watched the window more than he watched her. Days passed like smoke drifting up a chimney. One evening, as the light sank into blue, My Lin sat beside the fire reading aloud from an old book of poetry her husband had owned. Not for him, not at first, just to hear her own voice again. The way it filled the cracks in the silence. He listened, and she felt it. The shift. The moment when presence became companionship. When the lines between stranger and something else began to blur. That night, she left an extra blanket at the foot of his cot. The wind outside howled again, another storm was coming. My Lin sat long that night, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of his breathing mingled with the crackle of fire. It struck her quietly that for the first time in many winters, she wasn't alone. Out beyond the cabin, the snow fell in steady drifts, covering tracks and truths alike. In Silver Creek, no one knew what the widow had done. Not yet. But winter knows how to keep secrets, at least for a while. The days settled into a rhythm, deliberate as snowfall. The man, still unnamed, grew stronger. His fever had broken, though his wound remained a taut and aching thing. My Lin tended him with the same quiet persistence she gave to her woodpile or her dough. She asked nothing of him. He spoke no English, or if he did, he chose not to use it. Instead, he nodded when she passed him broth and listened as she read aloud. Their communication unfolded like the unfurling of cold hands beside a fire, gradual, unsure, then unmistakably warm. Sometimes he watched her work, eyes tracking the movement of her hands. She moved with a grace forged by years of necessity. She chopped wood, knelt in the snow to fix a broken fence, and stitched the worn lining of her coat. He'd become part of the cabin's breath, an echo made flesh. She found herself making a second cup of tea without thinking, found herself brushing snow from the window so he could see the moonlight. One night, she caught him standing barefoot by the door, staring at the trees. She didn't speak, only offered a blanket, which he took without thanks, but with a nod of acknowledgement. He began to help in small ways. First, he pulled water from the well when her shoulder ached. Then, he swept the cabin floor without being asked. She noticed but said nothing. Their silences stretched long but not lonely. When she read aloud, he would sometimes trace shapes in the air, sketching something only he could see. My Lin knew the world beyond their four walls would not be kind if it found him here. Her cabin was only a temporary shelter. Silver Creek was built on fences, wooden, spoken, and unwritten. They had strict expectations for women, for grief, for strangers, especially strangers with no name and a wound in their side. She remembered the stories the men in town told, stories meant to stir fear of cattle rustlers and outlaws who took what they wanted and left smoke behind. My Lin had nodded along back then, not because she believed it, but because disbelief didn't change the way men chose to live. But now, as she handed the man another cup of tea, her fingers brushing his, she felt the weight of those stories. This was no monster. He was a man who flinched when the wind howled and sat with quiet reverence before the fire. The snow outside piled high, walling them in with white silence. They shared food, heat, and the stillness of snow-covered evenings. She mended his shirt. He patched her roof during a brief thaw, his hands sure, his movements reverent. One morning, she found him watching her feed the chickens. She caught his eye and asked, "You ever keep chickens?" knowing he wouldn't answer in words. But his mouth curled at the corner and he shook his head. Then he pointed to the sky. She looked up. Grey clouds were rolling in. Another storm. He nodded. In that moment she understood they had come to a wordless agreement. He would not lie and she would not demand. There was no need. One night, after a long silence broken only by the hiss of the fire, he spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy from disuse. "Why?" She looked up from her sewing, knowing what he meant. Why had she helped him? She considered the fire, the shape of her hands in her lap, the feeling she hadn't had words for until now. "Because you were dying," she said. He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. She nodded. "Because I was too." There it was, the truth laid bare between them. His face shifted, a frown softened by a shared grief. He looked away, watching the fire as if reading something in its movement. The next morning, he handed her a carved stick. It wasn't elaborate, but it had care in it. A small, simple horse, head bowed, not running, but resting. She didn't ask what it meant. She understood. It was his way of saying thank you, or maybe, stay alive. The rhythm of their days didn't change much after that, but the silences did. They weren't gaps anymore, they were bridges. Still, My Lin felt something shifting. Not inside the cabin, but beyond it. A sense that the stillness they'd been borrowing was about to be reclaimed. One afternoon, while chopping wood, she saw a set of horse tracks cut fresh through the snow at the tree line. Not the town doctor's, not hers. Too deep, too straight. Someone had come near, maybe watched. She said nothing to the man that night, but she didn't sleep. The next morning, he stood near the window, watching the trees. He turned and looked at her. No words were needed. Something was coming. And so she poured another cup of tea, sat beside him, and let the silence speak what their voices could not. The morning they came was soft and silver with frost. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of stewed rabbit and pine smoke. The man she now thought of as Arthur was shaping a piece of wood near the fire, slow strokes of his knife carving into the grain. My Lin was mending a tear in a grain sack. They'd grown so used to the shared quiet that she almost missed the sound. Hooves, not one, but several. They didn't approach fast. It was not a raid, not a rescue. It was a decision arriving on horseback, wrapped in coats and law and fear. My Lin stood slowly, her heart climbing to her throat. Arthur was already looking at her. His knife was still. His eyes said what neither of them would say aloud, "They've come." The knock was fists and command. The door rattled once, twice. She opened it without reaching for her rifle. 3 men stood there, their breath steaming, guns easy on their hips. One was the sheriff, a man named Brody with salt in his beard and gravel in his voice. The others were ranchers, younger, but not gentler. "My Lin," Brody said, tilting his head. "We need to talk." Her mouth was dry. "It's early for a social call, Sheriff." "No one's here for that," said the one on the left, a sharp-jawed man named Finn. "He's in there, ain't he?" My Lin didn't look back. "He's healing." Brody stepped forward, boots crunching on the frozen threshold. "That man in there, he's a stranger. We've had reports of rustlers over at Dry Creek. You know what kind of trouble that brings." She looked him in the eye. "I know what kind of trouble fear makes." "Don't test me, My Lin," Brody said, his voice low. "People are stirred up. He's not safe here." He paused, his eyes flickering past her shoulder. "And you're making things harder than they need to be." She didn't move aside. "He's not a threat." Finn stepped forward. "You don't know that. He could have been part of the crew that took 3 head of cattle and left a man injured." "He's been in this cabin for over a month," she said. "I pulled him from the snow on Christmas Eve. You think he rode out from Dry Creek while bleeding to death in a blizzard?" The third man, silent until now, shifted uneasily. His eyes met hers with a flicker of doubt. He knew she was telling the truth, but knowing the truth was never enough in Silver Creek. Brody let out a long breath. "My Lin, listen. We can't have him here. Not like this. Folks are scared. They need a resolution." The word sat foul in the air. "If you want him, you'll have to see him." Brody nodded. They entered, their boots tracking mud onto the clean floor. Arthur stood at the hearth, not holding a weapon, just watching. The sheriff looked at him long and careful. Arthur didn't flinch. His face was stone, but his eyes were not. They held a calm and something deeper, the exhaustion of being judged. He doesn't look much like a rustler, the quiet man murmured. Finn snorted. Give him a chance. See how fast that changes. Mylin stepped closer to Arthur, placing herself between the fire and the men. Not with drama, just with choice. Brody rubbed his beard. Here's what we'll do, he said finally. We don't want blood. But we can't just let him go. Not after what's happened. It'd break the town in 2 inches. Mylin's jaw tightened. So, what do you want? Brody looked at her like the answer was simple. You're a widow. He's in your home. You saved his life. You're all the family he's got in this county. So make it legal. She blinked. Legal? A marriage, Brody said. Paper makes things cleaner. If he's your husband, he's one of us. That's how we keep the peace. Finn laughed, a sharp, mean sound. That's rich. Make her marry the drifter. Brody shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The room turned colder. Mylin looked at Arthur. His face had not changed, but something in him had gone very still. He was hearing the words, understanding enough. She whispered, so low only he could hear, they'll hang you if I say no. He nodded once, not to agree, but to accept. She looked back at Brody. You can draw up the papers. The next 2 hours passed like days. They brought the town clerk and a preacher. They did not bring celebration or smiles, just ink and obligation. The wedding was performed in the cabin. Mylin wore her work dress, its hem smudged with ash. Arthur wore the same clothes he had almost died in. There were no vows, just signatures. The clerk scrawled their names, writing Arthur's down as Arthur Doe. When the preacher said, Amen, Mylin didn't feel married. She felt claimed, like land, like cattle, like something bartered. Arthur stood beside her, a statue carved from dignity and silence. Welcome to Silver Creek, Brody said, clapping him on the shoulder. Then they left. The door shut with a finality that echoed too loud. For a long while, neither of them moved. Mylin finally turned to him. I didn't want that, she said softly. I wanted you to live. He nodded, then sat by the fire. The carving knife returned to his hand, his fingers working wood into shape. She watched him, the way his shoulders curved inward slightly, as if the weight of survival was heavier than death had been. The sun dipped low. The cabin, quiet again, now held a different silence, thicker, more complicated. Not peace, not even truce, just endurance. She sat across from him. The paper with their names on it sat on the table like a verdict. She looked at Arthur. He looked back. And for the first time, she saw something not just behind his eyes, but rising toward them. Not gratitude, not warmth, something harder, like resolve. The papers made it real for the town, but not for them. Inside the cabin, nothing had shifted except the weight of what had been taken from choice and turned into decree. Arthur moved through the cabin with the same silence, his hand still working wood, still mending the firewood pile. But now something in him moved a beat slower, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Mylin felt it too. She made their meals, swept the floors, and kept the silence between them from turning brittle. What she felt was a hunger to know who he was beyond what they'd made him. One morning, she found him sitting outside on the steps. Do you want to leave? She asked softly. His gaze didn't shift. Yes, there was no apology in it, just truth. She nodded. I wouldn't stop you. I know. That night, Arthur left the carving of the horse by her place at the table. It was finished now, poised and ready. She picked it up and looked across at him. It has a meaning, she asked. He studied her for a long moment. Yes, he hesitated, then answered with effort. It means I stayed. It was more than a thank you, more than a gift. It was a quiet proof that he had once chosen to remain, even before the town had forced the word husband onto him. They began to speak more after that, in short, deliberate exchanges. Words he had learned over weeks of listening began to find their way out. She learned his name was Arthur, and he was a rancher from the south whose partner had cheated him, leaving him for dead after a dispute. "My family is gone," he said one evening. "I have no one." "You have a wife now," she said, the words tasting like irony. He looked at her then, not with a guarded distance, but with something closer to regard. "And you have a husband." They began to share more than work. He helped her fix the chicken coop. She showed him how to brew tea with wild mint. He drew maps in the dirt outside, places she'd never heard of. A kind of tenderness bloomed between them, not fast, but persistent like moss in shadow. They moved around each other with less distance. One morning, she found him humming low as he chopped wood. It wasn't a song she knew, but it calmed her. She began to hum it later as she worked. He noticed, smiled faintly, but said nothing. The town kept its distance, but not its whispers. Supplies came with tight-lipped glances. The preacher's wife no longer waved. Mylin didn't mind. The weight of their disapproval was less than the weight of pretending. One market day, she rode into town alone. The clerk gave her change without meeting her eyes. A boy spit near her boots and muttered something cruel. She didn't flinch. Back at the cabin, Arthur had made stew. She sat beside him and ate. When the bowl was empty, she said, "Thank you." He nodded. "You came back." "I said I would." "I know." She reached across the table, laying her fingers over his. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" she asked. His thumb moved slightly beneath hers. "Sometimes," he said. "But not every day." That night, as the fire cracked, Mylin reached for his hand again. This time, he held it. A week later, they were building a fence together. She held the post straight as he hammered. At one point, she lost balance and fell into him. He caught her, their eyes meeting close enough to feel each other's breath. He did not kiss her, but he didn't move away. That evening, she found an old tin box and filled it with seeds she'd been saving for spring. She handed the box to Arthur. "For the garden," she said. He opened it, sifting through the seeds with care. "You believe we'll still be here?" She thought for a long time. "I believe I want to be." He closed the box and nodded. "Then we plant." In the final weeks of winter, something changed again. The woods grew restless. Arthur watched the tree line longer each day. "There's talk among the pines," he said one night. "I feel it." She placed her hand over his. In the cabin, the paper with their names still hung above the hearth, but it no longer defined them. Their bond had shifted, no longer forged by fear, but chosen in hours of work and touch. They had not spoken of love, but something deeper had taken root. And though neither of them could say what the spring would bring, they both planted the garden together.